A soft bristle brush sweeps across a block of brilliant white limestone. It clears away a layer of fine powder, finally exposing the dark, gleaming enamel of a massive conical tooth. The rock itself was laid down at the bottom of a shallow, warm sea. As the paleontologist works a steel pick around the edge of the root, the true scale of the specimen emerges. This isn't just a single tooth. It is a massive section of jawbone, nearly a meter long, heavily packed with recurved teeth designed to puncture and hold. This block of stone was pulled from the chalk quarries near Maastricht, in the Netherlands. When these jaws were first brought into the light in the late 18th century, they did more than represent a new species. They broke the prevailing understanding of the natural world. In Paris, the foremost anatomist of the era, Georges Cuvier, approached the Maastricht specimen. He didn't rely on myth. He used the cold, comparative logic of a biological engineer. Imagine him laying the fossil jaws on a heavy wooden table, systematically measuring them against the skeletal structures of living animals. He looked at the jaw joints of crocodiles. He examined the dentition of toothed whales, and the skulls of terrestrial lizards. The anatomy left no room for doubt. The creature was a squamate, a marine lizard of terrifying, almost unthinkable proportions. Cuvier named the animal inferred from these bones Mosasaurus hoffmanii. But his most profound realization came from geography, not just the bones themselves. If a marine lizard the size of a whale still hunted in the world's oceans, the global maritime fleets of the era would have crossed its path. Because it was nowhere to be found in the modern seas, Cuvier concluded it must be gone entirely. The Maastricht jaws provided the first widely accepted scientific proof that species could go extinct. They proved that the Earth possessed a deep, lost history entirely separate from the present day. SRC 01, Cuvier, 1808. To understand how a terrestrial lizard evolved into an apex oceanic predator capable of changing the history of science, we cannot start in the chalk seas of the late Cretaceous. We have to look at the very origin of marine reptiles. Long before the first mosasaur or dinosaur ever walked the Earth, we reset the timeline. The Permian period, about 299 million years ago, the physical map of the planet is completely unrecognizable. All major land masses are crushed together into a single supercontinent, Pangaea. Surrounding it is a vast, global ocean known as Panthalassa. On land, terrestrial reptiles are a highly successful, rapidly diversifying group. They owe their absolute dominance to a single, profound evolutionary innovation, the amniotic egg. By encasing their embryos in a waterproof membrane and a leathery shell, reptiles finally severed their ultimate tie to the water. Unlike amphibians, which must return to ponds and rivers to spawn, reptiles essentially carry their own private, internal bond with them. They are free to colonize the deep, dry interiors of the continents. Yet, almost as soon as they conquer the dry land, the stratigraphy shows a paradoxical shift. Some lineages turn around. They walk right back into the surf. The catalyst for this return was the most catastrophic biological event in the history of the planet. At the boundary of the Permian and Triassic periods, a massive release of volcanic greenhouse gases triggers a runaway climate crisis, known as the Great Dying. This extinction event exterminates an estimated 96% of all marine species. Reef systems collapse. The complex food webs of Panthalassa disintegrate entirely. But in the long arc of deep time, a mass extinction is not just a tragic ending. It is an ecological vacuum. The shallow coastal waters are suddenly emptied of their apex predators and their heavy competitors. The ocean simply becomes an open frontier. Our first evidence of this tentative return to the sea is found in small, delicate fossils preserved in dark, fine-grained shale. A prime example is Mesosaurus, a reptile barely a meter long. When we examine a beautifully flattened slab containing a Mesosaurus skeleton, the early adaptations to an aquatic life are immediately visible. The tail is elongated and laterally compressed, forming a primitive paddle. The hind limbs are robust, likely webbed to provide propulsion. But the skull tells us exactly how it survived. The snout is drawn out into a long, narrow rostrum, lined with dozens of incredibly fine, needle-like teeth. These teeth are far too fragile to crush armor or grapple with large, struggling prey. By comparing this delicate dental architecture to modern aquatic feeders, researchers infer that Mesosaurus used its jaws like a biological sieve. It likely snapped its head laterally through the water, trapping small, soft-bodied invertebrates while letting the waters drain out between the dense teeth. But Mesosaurus represents a turning point in our understanding for a reason that extends far beyond its feeding habits. If we map every known Mesosaurus quarry in the world, the pins cluster in only two specific places: the sedimentary basins of southern Brazil and the southwestern coast of Africa. Today, those two populations are separated by thousands of miles of the deep Atlantic Ocean. Mesosaurus was a coastal, shallow-water animal. Its skeleton was entirely incapable of surviving a transoceanic migration. In the early 20th century, Alfred Wegener looked at this exact geographic distribution and used it as physical proof for his theory of continental drift. The only logical explanation for the fossil's location was that the rock layers of Brazil and Africa were once locked together as a single, continuous coastline. The bones of this small marine reptile became the anchor that proved the continents themselves are in motion. Mesosaurus was an early, modest experiment in aquatic living. But evolution, when handed an empty ecosystem entirely devoid of competition, can accelerate at a staggering pace. To see the physical results of this acceleration, we have to leave the coastal shales and travel to the high, arid ridges of modern-day Nevada. We reset the timeline. The Middle Triassic, about 244 million years ago, a field crew works under the desert sun, using rock saws and heavy pry bars to remove blocks of dense, gray limestone from a steep hillside. They are exposing the remains of a creature that abandoned the shoreline entirely and committed to the open ocean. It is an early member of the Ichthyosaurs, a highly successful lineage of marine reptiles. Once the specimen is carefully jacketed in plaster, airlifted off the mountain, and meticulously prepared in the lab, the true scale of the animal finally emerges. A researcher pulls a long steel measuring tape across the length of the prepped skull. The head alone measures over 2 meters from the tip of the snout to the back of the brain case. This is Symbospondylus youngorum, based on scaling models of the skull and the massive, articulated vertebrae recovered from the quarry. Biomechanical reconstructions project a total body length of approximately 17 meters. It was a true leviathan. It easily rivaled the size of modern sperm whales, armed with conical teeth capable of tearing apart large prey in the open water. But the sheer size of the animal is only half the story. The true revelation comes from the rock layers directly above and below the fossil horizon. Within this limestone formation are thin bands of volcanic ash, laid down by ancient eruptions. By measuring the radioactive decay of isotopes within these ash beds, geologists can bracket the age of the fossil with incredibly high precision. The dates reveal a stunning evolutionary reality. Symbospondylus youngorum achieved its massive, 17-meter scale just a few million years after the Permian extinction wiped the oceans clean. When we compare this timeline to the modern ocean, the contrast is stark. It took terrestrial mammals, the ancestors of today's whales, tens of millions of years of gradual skeletal modification to transition from dog-sized coastal scavengers to gigantic pelagic filter feeders. The radiometric dating of the Nevada ash beds proves that early ichthyosaurs achieved comparable gigantism in a fraction of that time. They capitalized on an ocean that was temporarily devoid of apex competition, growing exponentially to fill the void at the top of the food chain. SRC 03, Sander et al. 2021. Yet, as impressive as this rapid growth is, raw size alone does not guarantee survival in the ocean. Getting bigger is merely a matter of caloric intake and extended growth cycles. The true challenge of a fully pelagic life is physics. Water is a dense, unforgiving medium. It is roughly 800 times denser than the air these animals' ancestors evolved to breathe. It resists every single movement. It punishes biomechanical inefficiency by rapidly draining an animal's energy reserves. A terrestrial reptile cannot simply hold its breath and swim into the deep ocean using legs designed for walking on dirt. To truly conquer Panthalassa, the marine reptiles had to completely dismantle and re-engineer their terrestrial skeletons, under the bright, unsparing lights of a comparative anatomy lab. A researcher aligns three distinct sets of skeletal forelimbs on a dark mat. The first is a cast of a human hand, displaying the familiar arrangement of wrist bones and 5 distinct digits. The second is the articulated front foot of a modern monitor lizard. It is fundamentally similar in its structural blueprint, featuring elongated toes heavily adapted for gripping terrestrial surfaces. The third is a fossilized flipper pulled from a Mesozoic ichthyosaur. When these three limbs are viewed side by side, the relentless engineering demands of the ocean become physically legible. Moving through the air requires very little effort to push the atmosphere out of the way. But water is an incredibly dense, viscous fluid. Every forward motion creates massive drag, and any irregularity on the surface of an animal generates turbulence. That turbulence drains energy. To survive as an active predator in the open ocean, an animal must adopt a fusiform shape. It needs a body that is perfectly tapered at both ends, like a teardrop or a torpedo, allowing it to slice through the water with maximum hydrodynamic efficiency. But achieving that streamlined shape requires a radical dismantling of the terrestrial skeleton. When the researcher traces a finger down the ichthyosaur fossil, the exact mechanism of this transformation is laid bare. The upper arm still features a recognizable humerus, radius, and ulna, exactly like the lizard and the human. But below the wrist, the anatomy completely breaks the established rules of the tetrapod blueprint. Instead of 3 or 4 bones per finger, the ichthyosaur possesses digits made of dozens of tightly packed, disc-like bones. This process is called hyperphalangy, the evolutionary duplication of finger bones. By multiplying the phalanges and locking them all together within a sheath of soft tissue, the ichthyosaur transformed a flexible terrestrial hand into a stiff, highly efficient hydrofoil. It is a striking piece of direct evidence. It shows exactly how natural selection rewrites genetic code to solve a very specific physical problem. SRC05, Motani. 2005. But density is not the only challenge presented by the ocean. It is also a realm of crushing pressure and fading light. To investigate how marine reptiles adapted to the deep water column, we step forward in the timeline. The late Jurassic, about 160 million years ago, a paleontology technician uses a set of digital calipers to measure a specific feature on a skull resting on a foam cradle. The fossil belongs to an ichthyosaur named Ophthalmosaurus. The calipers extend incredibly wide, finally locking into place across a massive bony ring situated within the eye socket. This structure is the sclerotic ring. It is a circle of overlapping bone plates that functioned as an internal support scaffolding for the eyeball. In the deep ocean, intense water pressure can easily deform a large, soft eye, distorting vision. The sclerotic ring acts as a structural reinforcement, holding the eye perfectly spherical under immense physical strain. When the diameter of the sclerotic ring is measured, the true scale of the Ophthalmosaurus eye is revealed to be staggering. It often exceeds 20 centimeters across, occupying nearly the entire depth of the skull. Now, the fossil record cannot preserve the soft retinal tissue of the inner eye. We cannot know exactly what colors or contrasts it saw. But this bony aperture establishes a strict, undeniable physical constraint. By comparing the size of this opening to the focal length of the skull, biophysicists can calculate the absolute minimum light-gathering capability of the animal. The geometry of the Ophthalmosaurus eye proves it was heavily adapted for extreme low-light environments. It was highly capable of hunting squid and small fish at tremendous depths, or during the darkest hours of the oceanic night. It is a sensory adaptation driven entirely by the physics of light attenuation in seawater. We know from their skeletal anatomy that ichthyosaurs possessed stiff paddles and massive, reinforced eyes. But bone alone only tells a partial story. To truly understand their hydrodynamic perfection, we need to see the spaces between the bones. Soft tissue, the skin, the muscle, and the cartilage, decays rapidly after death, usually leaving absolutely no trace. But in specific, exceedingly rare geological conditions, the ghost of the animal survives the decay process. In a museum collection drawer in Germany, a massive, heavy slab of dark shale is carefully pulled into the light. It was quarried from the Posidonia shale, a rock formation laid down in the early Jurassic, known to geologists as the Holzmaden deposits. Preserved exactly within the center of the dark gray rock is an articulated ichthyosaur skeleton. But the bones themselves are not the most remarkable feature of the slab. Surrounding the skeleton is a distinct, darker silhouette. It is a carbonized halo, pressed permanently into the stone. When this ichthyosaur died, it sank to the bottom of a stagnant, anoxic sea floor. The total lack of oxygen prevented scavengers and bacteria from destroying the carcass. Over millions of years, the immense weight of accumulating sediment crushed the animal perfectly flat. The organic molecules of its skin and muscle were essentially baked into a thin film of carbon. This two-dimensional flattening presents a specific constraint for researchers. It irreversibly crushes the three-dimensional volume of the animal, forcing paleontologists to reconstruct its actual living girth from a completely flat silhouette. However, the external perimeter it preserves provides an undeniable record of its living shape. The dark halo reveals critical structures that left no skeletal signature whatsoever. On the back of the animal, the carbon traces at all. Triangular dorsal fin, completely unsupported by bone. It functioned exactly like the dorsal fin of a modern dolphin, stabilizing the animal against rolling in the water. At the rear, the silhouette proves the existence of a massive, vertical tail fluke. Yet, unlike a modern shark, where the spinal column bends upward into the top half of the tail, the ichthyosaur's vertebrae curve sharply downward, supporting the lower lobe of the tail instead. The Holzmaden shale provides the ultimate taphonomic proof of convergent evolution. Through hyperphalangy and soft tissue engineering, ichthyosaurs fully surrendered their terrestrial heritage to become perfect biological torpedoes. They imitated the shape of fish because the physical laws of the ocean permitted no other efficient design. But evolution is rarely limited to a single solution. While the ichthyosaurs were mastering the torpedo equation, another group of terrestrial reptiles waded into the exact same waters. Instead of copying the fish, they engineered a radically different, entirely unprecedented biomechanical solution for oceanic flight. A massive, heavy block of sandstone rests on a reinforced steel table in a paleontology prep lab. Extending outward from the center of the block are the fossilized remains of a pelvic girdle. The bones are enormous, flat, and broad. They resemble heavy shields rather than the delicate, rod-like hip bones of terrestrial reptiles. A researcher leans close, tracing a finger along a series of roughened ridges and deep depressions on the surface of the bone. These are muscle scars. They are the physical anchor points where massive bundles of soft tissue once attached to the skeleton in life. This pelvic girdle belongs to a plesiosaur, a lineage of marine reptiles that appeared late in the Triassic period and successfully hunted throughout the entire Mesozoic era. We reset the timeline. The late Triassic, about 203 million years ago. We see an animal that completely rejected the evolutionary path taken by the ichthyosaurs. Instead of a torpedo-shaped body propelled by a tail fluke, plesiosaurs possessed a wide, somewhat flattened torso, a short tail entirely useless for propulsion, and for massive, elongated flippers. The mechanics of how this animal actually moved through the water represent one of the most complex engineering problems in vertebrate paleontology. We cannot simply drop a living plesiosaur into a tank and watch it swim. We must reverse engineer the motion entirely from the constraints of the skeleton. The sheer size of the pelvic and shoulder girdles, combined with the heavy muscle scarring, clearly indicates that the primary propulsive force came from the limbs, not the spine. But how exactly were those heavy limbs utilized? Early hypotheses suggested a rowing motion, something similar to a dog paddle or the movement of a duck. In this model, the limbs push backward against the water and are then dragged forward on the recovery stroke. But when researchers digitized the plesiosaur skeleton and input the specific joint articulations into computational fluid dynamic models, the rowing hypothesis collapses. A rowing motion generates massive drag on the recovery stroke. It is far too metabolically expensive for a large, active predator to sustain. Instead, the anatomical constraints point directly to a motion known as underwater flight. By twisting the leading edge of the flipper downward on the downstroke, and then tilting it slightly upward on the upstroke, a plesiosaur could generate continuous forward thrust throughout the entire cycle. It is a highly efficient form of locomotion. We see it used today by sea turtles and penguins. The fossilized joints of the plesiosaur shoulder and hip physically restrict the rotation of the flipper, and they align perfectly with the limited arc required for this flying motion. However, recognizing how the individual flipper moved does not completely settle the mechanics of the entire animal. The plesiosaur presents a unique problem. It is the only known vertebrate in Earth's history to utilize 4 hydrofoils simultaneously. This introduces a major boundary to our current knowledge. Do the front and rear flippers stroke together in a synchronized rhythm? Or do they alternate? This remains a subject of active, rigorous debate within biomechanics. Some computer models suggest that if the rear flippers stroke slightly out of phase with the front, they can actually catch the turbulent wake generated by the leading flippers. This harvests extra thrust, drastically increasing overall efficiency. Other models argue a synchronous stroke provides far more stability. The limit of our certainty is dictated entirely by the taphonomy of the fossils. We have the bones, but we are missing the stiff cartilage that extended the trailing edge of the flipper. Without knowing the exact flexibility of that missing tissue, we simply cannot definitively program the timing of the stroke. We know they flew through the water, but the exact rhythm of their flight remains elusive. If their locomotion is an engineering marvel, the anatomy of their necks is a study in extreme specialization. In many plesiosaur lineages, the neck elongates to absurd proportions. When we examine the articulated cervical vertebrae of a long-necked plesiosaur, the physical reality immediately dispels a long-standing myth. For decades, popular culture depicted these animals with heads raised high above the water, curving their long necks like swans to strike downward at prey. But when a researcher manually articulates 2 fossilized neck vertebrae on a lab bench, the osteology proves this posture is physically impossible. Protruding from the top of each vertebra are interlocking bony structures called zygapophyses. When the vertebrae are properly aligned, these joints slide over one another. While they do allow for significant lateral movement, sweeping their head widely from side to side, the zygapophyses physically lock together the moment the neck attempts a sharp upward bend. The bone itself halts the motion. This specific anatomical constraint demands a complete reinterpretation of their hunting strategy. They could not coil and strike like a snake. Instead, the stiff, elongated neck likely functioned as a biological fishing pole. By keeping their large, bulky bodies at a distance, they could sweep their small heads silently through schools of fish or squid. They grabbed prey before the heavy turbulence of their massive swimming flippers ever alerted the target. The plesiosaurs successfully engineered a unique method of 4-flipper flight and highly specialized feeding strategies. But navigating the deep ocean and catching fish are only the daily mechanics of survival. To maintain a population over millions of years, an animal must solve a far more fundamental biological problem. And for a fully pelagic marine reptile, that problem presents a seemingly insurmountable physical barrier. The amniotic egg is the evolutionary masterpiece that allowed terrestrial reptiles to conquer the land. by encasing the embryo in fluid and a breathable, leathery shell. The egg functions as a self-contained life support system. But this brilliant adaptation comes with a fatal flaw when applied directly to the ocean. The shell is permeable, designed to allow oxygen in and carbon dioxide out. If an amniotic egg is completely submerged underwater, the pores flood. The embryo drowns. For early marine reptiles, this physical constraint presented a massive evolutionary hurdle. Modern sea turtles solve the problem by retaining their terrestrial legs. They drag themselves onto beaches under the cover of darkness to bury their eggs safely in the dry sand. But looking at the skeletons of an adult ichthyosaur or a plesiosaur, it is instantly apparent that beach nesting was impossible. Their limbs were highly derived, stiffened hydrofoils, entirely useless for bearing heavy weight on land. If a heavy, four-flipped plesiosaur washed ashore, its ribcage would likely collapse under its own massive weight, quickly suffocating the animal. They were permanently, irreversibly pelagic, if they could not lay eggs on land, and eggs drown in the water. How did they reproduce? The answer was found, once again, in the exceptionally preserved dark shales of Holzmarden. Within the museum collections are spectacular slabs containing the articulated skeletons of adult female ichthyosaurs, preserved at the exact moment of death. And trapped within the pelvic regions of these females are the tiny, fully articulated skeletons of ichthyosaur infants. The physical evidence is undeniable. Ichthyosaurs bypassed the egg entirely. They gave birth to live young directly into the open ocean. But the taphonomy of these fossils reveals a critical detail about the mechanics of this live birth. The infants are fossilized emerging from the birth canal tail first. In most terrestrial mammals, head first birth is the norm, allowing the infant to begin breathing air as soon as the head clears the mother. In the ocean, a head first birth is lethal. If the infant's head emerges into the water while the rest of its body is still trapped in the birth canal, the infant will instinctively attempt to take its first breath and drown. By emerging tail first, the head remains closely connected to the mother's oxygen supply until the very last second. This allows the newborn to immediately swim to the surface for air. The Holzmarden fossils demonstrate that marine reptiles solved the mechanical problem of underwater birth exactly the same way modern dolphins and whales do today. While ichthyosaur viviparity was well documented, the reproductive strategy of the plesiosaurs remained a frustrating void in the fossil record for over a century. That void was finally filled in 2011. Researchers carefully prepared a massive block of chalk from Kansas, dating to the late Cretaceous, about 78 million years ago. The block contained the fossilized skeleton of Polycotylus, a mid-sized, short-necked plesiosaur. As the preparators slowly removed the white matrix surrounding the adult's rib cage, they uncovered a cluster of much smaller bones. At first glance, small bones within the stomach cavity of a predator usually indicate a recent meal. But as the anatomy was carefully mapped and identified, the interpretation shifted dramatically. The small bones were not a jumble of digested fish or squid. They were the partially articulated remains of a single, juvenile Polycotylus. The orientation of the skeleton within the maternal body cavity, combined with the total absence of any fossilized eggshell material or acid etching from digestion, confirmed it was a fetus. Like the ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs gave birth to live young. SRC02, O'Keefe and Kiap. 2011. But the Polycotylus fossil forced a profound biological reframe of the entire lineage. When the researchers measured the fetal bones and compared them to the adult skeleton, the ratio was shocking. The fetus was massive. It is estimated to be nearly a third of the mother's total body length at birth. In ecology, reproductive strategies generally fall on a spectrum. On one end is our selection. This involves producing hundreds of tiny offspring with little to no maternal investment, hoping a few survive. Exactly like a modern sea turtle. On the other end is K-selection. This means investing massive amounts of energy and time into gestating a single, large offspring. ensuring it has a significant survival advantage at birth. The polycotylus fossil proves that plesiosaurs did not just give birth to live young. They achieved the extreme K-selected maternal investment characteristic of modern marine mammals. Birthing a single, massive infant requires tremendous physiological resources. Now, the fossil record cannot preserve the behavioral interactions of long-dead animals. We cannot confirm if they lived in tight-knit social pods or exactly how long a mother protected her calf. But the sheer biological cost of the pregnancy strongly infers an extended period of maternal care. This single block of Kansas chalk effectively ended the era of viewing plesiosaurs as primitive sea monsters. They were highly complex, K-selected marine engineers, navigating the oceans with a reproductive ecology strikingly similar to the whales that would eventually replace them. But as the plesiosaurs invested heavily in their massive, single offspring, the late Cretaceous oceans were shifting. The ichthyosaurs, the perfect biological torpedoes, had quietly vanished from the fossil record, leaving the apex predator niches vacant. And into that void swam a new lineage of reptiles, armed with a sensory apparatus that would turn them into the most formidable killers the oceans had ever seen. We reset the timeline. The late Cretaceous, about 68 million years ago, on a bright lab monitor. A researcher scrolls through a sequence of grayscale images. They are viewing the high-resolution CT scans of a heavy, robust upper jawbone belonging to Mosasaurus hoffmanii. The exterior of the fossil is smooth and dense, punctuated by a series of small, visible holes running along the gumlin. But when the digital slice cuts into the interior volume of the bone, the solid structure gives way to a complex, branching network of hollow tunnels. These tunnels once housed the trigeminal nerve system. In terrestrial animals, the trigeminal nerve governs facial sensation. By tracing these empty canals through the fossilized maxilla, researchers can reconstruct a highly derived sensory map. The canals branch outward, terminating at the small holes on the surface of the snout, known as foramina. This specific anatomical architecture is not unique to mosasaurs. A nearly identical internal network is found in the snouts of modern crocodilians. SRC04, Schulp et al. 2013, in Living Crocodiles. These foramina house highly specialized pressure receptors. These receptors are so incredibly sensitive that a crocodile resting in murky water can detect the faint, rhythmic vibrations of an animal walking on the riverbank or a fish swimming several meters away. The presence of this massive, interconnected nerve network in the Mosasaurus snout strongly infers a similar capability. The physical evidence alters our understanding of how these animals dominated their environment. They did not need to rely solely on ambient light to track prey. By feeling the pressure waves generated by swimming plesiosaurs or large fish, mosasaurs could hunt effectively in the deep, dark water column, or during the pitch-black hours of the oceanic night. But the tactile snout is only one part of their sensory arsenal. To understand the full scope of their capabilities, we look not just at their fossils, but at their living relatives. When we map the evolutionary tree of squamates, mosasaurs branch off directly alongside modern terrestrial monitor lizards and snakes. This phylogenetic relationship allows paleontologists to use modern anatomy to infer ancient, unfossilized traits. A modern monitor lizard, like a Komodo dragon, possesses a highly specialized structure in the roof of its mouth called a Jacobson's organ. When the lizard flicks its forked tongue into the air, it collects chemical particles, pulling them back into the mouth and pressing them into the Jacobson's organ to taste the environment. It is an incredibly precise method of tracking prey or locating carrion over vast distances, because mosasaurs are deeply nested within this specific lineage of lizards. The principle of phylogenetic bracketing strongly suggests they retained a functional Jacobson's organ. However, here we face a distinct limit in our methodology. Soft tissue sensory organs simply do not fossilize. We cannot prove exactly how efficiently this system worked underwater compared to a terrestrial snake. while water transmits chemical scent trails far better than air. The physical mechanism of how a mosasaur delivered those chemicals to the organ without drowning remains a subject of speculative reconstruction. Despite this uncertainty, the combination of a crocodilian pressure-sensing snout and the inferred chemical tracking of a monitor lizard paints a picture of an apex predator perfectly tuned to exploit every dimension of the marine environment. Their physical mechanics were equally devastating. The mosasaurus skull retains a flexible joint midway down the lower jaw. It is a kinetic hinge inherited from its lizard ancestors. This joint allowed the jaw to flex outward, significantly expanding the gape to swallow massive prey whole. They were the ultimate generalists, fully equipped to hunt anything that shared their waters. By the very end of the Cretaceous period, the mosasaurs had diversified into dozens of species, completely dominating every ocean basin on the planet. Some possessed rounded, crushing teeth designed to obliterate the thick shells of giant ammonites and marine turtles. Others evolved slender, highly streamlined bodies that pushed the extreme limits of aquatic speed. They were the undisputed lords of the Panthalassa. They were the culmination of over 100 million years of convergent evolution and selective pressure. They had achieved maximum size, supreme sensory capabilities, and absolute ecological dominance. Yet, in the brutal arithmetic of deep time, the very traits that secure absolute dominance are often the exact same traits that ensure total annihilation. We reset the timeline. 66 million years ago, in a paleontology lab, a researcher places a cylindrical core of rock onto a viewing table. This core was drilled from the Earth's crust near the Chicxulub crater in Mexico, and it represents the most important physical boundary in the geologic record. The lower half of the core is composed of bright, white Cretaceous chalk. It is formed from the crushed calcium carbonate shells of trillions of microscopic marine organisms. It represents a vibrant, sunlit ocean ecosystem. Then, abruptly, the white chalk ends. It is capped by a stark, dark band of clay, heavily enriched with iridium, a rare metal abundant in asteroids. Above this dark line, the rock changes entirely, transitioning into the muted greys and browns of the Paleogene period. This core sample is the physical manifestation of the KPG extinction event. When a massive asteroid impacted the Yucatan Peninsula, it did not just incinerate the immediate landscape. The impact ejected millions of tons of pulverized rock and aerosolized sulfur into the upper atmosphere. It wrapped the planet in a thick, global shroud of darkness. The immediate effect of this darkness on the oceans was devastating. Without sunlight, the foundation of the marine food web, the photosynthetic phytoplankton and the calcareous nanoplankton that built the white chalks, suffered a catastrophic collapse. The microscopic base of the ocean starved. And that starvation rapidly cascaded upward. The ammonites, the coiled, shelled cephalopods that filled the mid-levels of the food chain, vanished entirely from the fossil record immediately above the iridium layer. For the mosasaurs and the plesiosaurs, this collapse was a death sentence. As apex predators, their survival depended on an unbroken, high-energy food chain. A massive, high-metabolism mosasaur required a staggering daily caloric intake just to maintain its bulk and power its complex sensory systems. When the schools of fish and ammonites disappeared, the mosasaurs had no alternative food source. The precise adaptations that made them the perfect killers, their immense size, their kinetic jaws, their absolute reliance on large, active prey, became fatal liabilities in a starving ocean. They were trapped at the top of a pyramid that no longer had a base. Above the dark clay boundary, the massive marine reptile fossils simply ceased to exist in the rock record. The apex trap had snapped shut, yet, amid this total oceanic devastation, the fossil record reveals a profound paradox. If we look closely at the strata directly above the boundary line, we find that a few marine reptiles swam right through the apocalypse. A heavy, ribbed carapace sits mounted in a museum display. It belongs to Archelon, a massive sea turtle from the late Cretaceous. and a close relative of the turtles that survive today. Why did the mosasaurs perish? While the turtles quietly crossed the boundary of extinction, the answer lies in the fundamental difference between specialization and resilience. Turtles, unlike the high metabolism apex predators, were primarily low-energy generalists. They did not require massive amounts of active, fleeing prey to survive. Many lineages fed on the very bottom of the food web. They grazed on resilient algae, hunted slow-moving jellyfish, or scavenged whatever organic material drifted into the shallow waters. Their lower metabolic rates allowed them to survive long periods of extreme caloric scarcity. While the apex specialists starved, the generalists simply endured. But diet alone does not explain all the survivors. When paleontologists track the extinction rates of crocodilians across the KPG boundary, a fascinating pattern emerges. The fully marine crocodiles, which hunted in the open oceans alongside the mosasaurs, were wiped out entirely. But the freshwater crocodilians, the ancestors of the alligators and crocodiles that inhabit modern rivers and swamps, survived with relatively few losses. By analyzing the isotopes preserved in the sediments of these ancient rivers, researchers can reconstruct the specific ecological mechanisms that saved them. Unlike the open ocean, which relies entirely on active photosynthesis, freshwater river systems possess a built-in safety net. Rivers are heavily fed by detritus, dead leaves, rotting wood, and organic soil constantly wash in from the surrounding landmass. When the asteroid shrouded the Earth and stopped photosynthesis, the trees on land died. But their massive bulk of rotting organic matter continued to wash down into the rivers. This dead plant material sustained a detritus-based food web. It fed the aquatic insects and invertebrates, which in turn fed the fish, which ultimately sustained the crocodilians. The rivers functioned as an ecological bunker. They were buffered by the slow decay of the terrestrial world, while the photosynthesis-dependent oceans completely starved. SRC 06, Sheehan and Hansen. 1986. The extinction of the great marine reptiles left the oceans emptier than they had been in over 180 million years. The mosasaurs, the plesiosaurs, and the ichthyosaurs were gone, leaving behind no descendants. But the physical laws of the Panthalassa remained exactly the same. The ocean still demanded fusiform shapes to overcome drag. It still required viviparity for a fully pelagic life. Within a few million years of the extinction, a new group of terrestrial animals, small, four-legged mammals, waded into the shallows to exploit the empty ecosystem. Driven by the exact same physical constraints, they slowly dismantled their terrestrial skeletons. They duplicated their finger bones through hyperphalange to form stiff paddles. They elongated their bodies into perfect biological torpedoes. They abandoned the land entirely, giving birth to massive, single calves directly into the water. When we look at a modern whale or a dolphin, we are not looking at a completely novel biological invention. We are looking at a mammalian echo of a reptilian blueprint. The marine reptiles were the true architects of the deep, engineering the exact biomechanical and reproductive solutions that mammals would later inherit. Today, the ocean is completely ruled by the descendants of terrestrial mammals. But every time a sea turtle pulls itself onto a dark beach, or a marine iguana dives into the cold surf, we are catching a glimpse of the original lords of the sea, who conquered the crushing physics of the water long before the first whale ever took a breath.